Welcome back. The Nugent Commission that concluded its work a few months back found that the South African Revenue Services operations were degraded under the leadership of Commissioner Tom Moyane, and that contributed to the undercollection of taxes. The impact is that we now pay more VAT, and my guest is prominent judge and tax expert Professor Dennis Davis, who joins us. And welcome, Prof. Pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure to be here, Tim.
Now, was the Nugent inquiry necessary? Because the former commissioner feels that this was set up just to deal with him specifically and personally. And if that is the case, his argument, if that is the case, then it makes South Africans ask themselves the question, why were disciplinary procedures preferred against him instead of this big commission or inquiry that we had?
There was supposed to have been a disciplinary inquiry dealt with by Advocate Bam. That sort of went by the wayside because there was all sorts of litigation threatened by Mr. Moyane, which did in fact take place. But actually one needed a commission because one needed to look at exactly what was going on in SARS, what were the problems and how could one fix them. And I think those went, although Mr. Moyane was central to that, I think it is true that that went way beyond Mr. Moyane, meaning how were we going to get SARS back to the institution that it once was, particularly under the then Commissioner Praveen Gordhan.
Now, from your point of view and also the findings of the Nugent Commission, what do you think were the key outcomes that, if implemented, in terms of the recommendations, if implemented, would improve the situation at SARS?
Well, I suppose the first thing one has to say this up front is clearly they found that Mr. Moyane himself was critically responsible, not on his own, but certainly was part of the problem which had created a significant undercollection of tax. I'll come to the other reasons for undercollection of tax in a moment. But it was clear that they needed to have a Commissioner of Inland Revenue who was going to turn the institution around and bring it back to what it was. In addition to which, they found that there were critical elements of SARS which had been degraded. The whole organizational model, which had apparently been proposed by Bain, I might add, at huge cost to the taxpayer, was utterly useless. And so you needed to, as it were, reconstitute the large corporate center. You had to deal with high net worth individuals. You had to deal with the transfer pricing problems. And then also what the Nugent Commission was concerned to deal with was how would you develop an accountable SARS. That means not one that's not independent, but at least which would be accountable, one, to the public it serves and to the government that's to whom it serves. And that was why the whole series of proposals were made in relation thereto. So it's a very comprehensive report dealing with, as it were, the health of the organisation of SARS and how to put it right. But obviously Mr. Moyane was part of that.
Now, the whole matter of the so-called rogue unit also appears to have been central to the operations at SARS. And, of course, that's the first unit that it appears former Commissioner Tom Moyane went after. And with the media also working the public to believe that there was something wrong that was going on within SARS with regards to that rogue unit. What's your view of how that matter was handled by Mr. Moyane, as well as the involvement to some extent by parts of the media?
Well, I think let's start with the media first, because that's the easiest part. I think it's perfectly clear that certain parts of the media, and you've been fairly careful about not mentioning them, but certain prominent newspapers clearly have a huge amount to account for, because they ruin people's lives, because they undermine the integrity of the institution, and because to a large degree they chased stories that had absolutely no justification or substantiation. One can only express the view that that was an absolute dark day for journalism in South Africa, and hopefully it'll never happen again. Talk about fake news. That was fake news. In relation to the question of the rogue unit as a whole, of course we now know, because Judge Nugent, who's a hugely experienced and incredibly able jurist, together with his associates, the other members of the committee, the commission, they found that there was no substantiation in any argument that that which was established was contrary to any law. And let me add that it is vitally important not to call it a rogue unit, but to call it a unit which deals with the problem of illicit income flows and illegality, which undermines our tax system. It's crucial to have a unit like that. All responsible tax authorities all over the world have that. And and the fact that we were denied that sort of investigative capacity meant that issues such as customs were completely undermined, and all sorts of illegal products flowed into the country without any kind of governance in relation thereto. So to be honest, the rogue unit, as they call it, has no justification in law if you read the Nugent report, and certainly when I read it myself, it seemed to me to be utterly cogent and utterly right in law. And it's about time we put this whole thing to bed once and for all and moved on to the idea that we must reconstitute some form of intelligence unit within SARS to deal with illicit income flows. I might add that if we have a look at the Mbeki report, which deals with illicit income flows throughout Africa, it's obvious that you have to have a unit like this to deal with these particular problems.
I will come to the illicit flows that the Mbeki report mentions, as well as the lifestyle audits and so forth. But I want to go back or stay for a moment with this point of the so-called rogue unit, the intelligence unit anyway. That was the purpose it was set up for, to investigate compliance and then recommend appropriate action when necessary. But the lawmakers themselves, some parliamentarians believed those newspaper reports, for instance, and people in the executive used the published reports to say that this was a rogue unit, thus working the public's imagination to say action has to be taken against such people. So, I mean, you say in law it was necessary, it was appropriate, that it should be there, it should be in place, right, to do exactly the work that it was doing to help with compliance. But the lawmakers, some of them, and people in the executive actually supported that it must be done away with. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, I think we now know why that was the case, because if we look at not just the Nugent Commission's report, which is what I'm relying on. I don't want to go further than that, because all I'm saying is I read that report. It seems to me to be utterly correct, and that should have put the whole thing to bed. But if we go beyond that for a moment, we know from that and testimony at the Zondo Commission that what this whole rogue unit was part of was a whole state capture narrative in which certain people will be singled out for special treatment, in particular the then Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. And that's the tragedy, that critical institutions of state were undermined by that which we've just experienced, 10 years of this kind of narrative. And it doesn't surprise me at all that people bought into it for all sorts of political reasons.
And, of course, the damage that was caused is there for everyone to see, and it's felt in the pockets of South African taxpayers, isn't it?
I don't want to talk about the politics of it all. It would be inappropriate of me to do so. I'm merely looking at it from a legal point of view. But I'm also looking at it from the point of view of somebody who's been involved in investigating the tax system of South Africa. And what you've said is the most important single point that I'd like to emphasize. Because SARS was undermined, because SARS came in with less revenue each and every year over the past few years than it did, it meant that taxes had to be increased. And you mentioned in your introduction, VAT was increased. And that affected poor people. Now, if we were able to collect probably the 20, 30 billion each year, which we should have collected, had SARS been the kind of institution that Judge Nugent now recommends it should be, we wouldn't have had to have increased VAT, and that would not have had an effect on poor people. So people who talk about the sort of developments that you and I are discussing at the moment need to bear in mind that this had a profound effect on people who are not just historically disadvantaged, people who are presently disadvantaged, happen to be the same people, and we should hang our heads in shame that we allowed this to happen.
Now, earlier you mentioned something about the illicit cash outflows of this economy, And according to the former President Mbeki's investigations together with his group, they found that this runs into billions of rands that's lost to South Africa every year and lost to the African continent every year. And you've done a lot of work around tax issues. From your experience, observations, research, how much money do you think is lost to this economy as a result of these illicit outflows?
It's almost impossible to quantify it, Tim. I can't do that. I can tell you that it runs into significant amount of billions. And it's perfectly clear that we now know, even if we look at the lost customs amounts of illegal goods coming to South Africa, that must run into many, many billions of rand. But I can tell you this, that if we look at, for example, what SARS should have been collecting as opposed to what SARS is collecting, we probably are 40, 50 billion shy each and every year. And you can then work out, that's obviously not just illicit flows, that's also tax avoidance and a whole range of elements which to some extent reflect the tax revolt. It is absolutely clear that people aren't paying what they should. So if you combine that with illicit flows, we're probably 40, 50 billion shy each and every year. And if you simply took, say, 60% of that and said, I was wrong, it's 25 a year, just think what effect that would have had on the economy, even if we weren't growing to the level that we should be.
Now, I wonder if laws help here in this regard to stop those types of practices, or is it the enforcement that is the issue here? Is it a law problem, or is it an enforcement problem?
I think there's three things, if I may. You know, the one thing is, obviously, I've been critical of SARS under the Mr. Moyane's regime following Judge Nugent. But I think it is true that there has been a declining tax morality in South Africa. And one has anecdotal evidence to that effect. But there is no doubt that one hears as well people not paying PAYE over, which they deduct from the employees, and not paying over to revenue. So there is, to some extent, a declining tax morality. That is also related to when we did another amnesty just recently. One would have expected not the 4 billion that was collected, but closer to 15 billion. That didn't come in. And again, I suspect, because sometimes I got people telling me this, their clients weren't prepared to come clean, because why should they, given the levels of corruption? I'm certainly not justifying their actions. I'm just explaining. So there's been a declining tax morality. There has also been significant practices of base erosion and profit shifting. That is manipulating royalty payments and the way you structure intellectual property, etc., to denude South Africa of much-needed revenue. And then there's plain illegality, of which, of course, those people who sit with large sums of money overseas that they've never disclosed are part of. And we know that there were many South Africans who were fingered in the Panama Papers and the other disclosures. So that's clearly indicative of a major problem. How do you deal with that? Well, we've got to, in fact, get rid of the declining tax morality. That will help by having a new Commission of Inland Revenue in. It will help if President Ramaphosa's attempts to ensure that corruption is eradicated bear fruit. And it will help if we have a better investigative capacity within SARS, going back to what I said earlier, because there's no doubt about it that deterrence is particularly important here. People need to know that if they're not going to pay their tax or they're going to try to illegally get money out of the country, they will go to jail. And if we could actually send a few people to jail, I assure you, tax morality will improve.
I'm talking to Judge Dennis Davis, a tax expert on the Nugent Commission's recommendations, as well as the tax situation in the country, as well as looking at ways of improving tax collection. You too, we invite you to participate in this conversation. Use the hashtag the Modise Network on social media. We'll continue our conversation in a moment.